In early September 1944, amid World War II, a series of terrifying events occurred in the small town of Mattoon, Illinois, USA. A mysterious tall man dressed all in black sprayed some kind of paralyzing gas into the windows of the townspeople. The whole town panicked, and the police and the FBI couldn't do anything about it. The men and women who did not go to the battlefield took the initiative to act on their own, patrolling the streets with whatever weapons they could find to hunt down the madman who was spreading the chemical gas. The authorities blamed the local newspapers for creating panic, while the experts simply described the Mattoon incident as a mass psychogenic illness caused by the war. Of course, all this did not satisfy the public, who thought that the statements of the authorities and experts were only meant to cover up the failure to reveal who and why the madman who spread the chemical gas did it. No one knows the identity of this man, his purpose, and where he disappeared to even now. It begins on September 1st, 1944, in the home of Aline Kearney and her sister Martha, who was staying with her. Meanwhile, Aline's husband was at work. Later that night, Aline was awakened by a strange odor she smelled in her bedroom. When she tried to move, her legs and body would not move. Aline found herself temporarily paralyzed, and a second later she felt a tightness, and her throat felt very dry. In a panic, Aline screamed for help, and Martha, who heard her sister scream, immediately woke up. Martha did not know what was happening or what to do, so she panicked and called Bert Kearney, Aline's husband. When Bert arrived at home, he saw a suspicious figure hiding near his wife's bedroom window. The man was tall, wearing dark clothes and a hat. Knowing that Bert had seen him, the suspicious figure turned and ran. Bert chased after him, but unfortunately, he was unable to catch him, and the figure disappeared into the darkness. Meanwhile, when Bert went into the house to check on his wife's condition, the paralysis Aline had felt earlier suddenly healed itself in about 30 minutes. Then the next day, September 2nd, 1944, a local newspaper called the Mattoon Journal-Gazette published a very sensational article entitled "Anesthetic Prowler on Loose," which reported the events experienced by Aline Kearney. The news published by the newspaper stated that Aline Kearney was the first victim. As the news spread, other stories of similar attacks began to surface, and panic set in. A local man named Urban Rafe and his wife reported that the night before Aline's attack, they were both awakened by a strange smell of smoke coming through their open bedroom window, after which they were paralyzed for nearly 90 minutes. According to Historic Mysteries, several similar cases were reported within days. About 35 people from the town's population of about 17,000 at the time claimed to have experienced similar symptoms after smelling a strange odor. Mrs. Charles Ryder reported an attack on the same night as Aline's. During the night, while she was still awake and drinking coffee, she heard the sound of a window being opened, followed by a strange odor that made her hands and feet tingling and made her dizzy. Another unnamed person reported a disgusting sweet smell that made her children vomit. Other people who claimed to have been attacked reported similar symptoms of nausea, vomiting, temporary paralysis, mild headaches, difficulty breathing, burning sensations, and even vomiting blood. And all of the victims reported a strange odor spreading through their homes before the symptoms appeared. A few days later, on the evening of September 5th, 1944, the first real clue in the Mad Gasser case was found at the home of Carl and Beulah Cordes. As the story goes, Cordes found a small piece of cloth on their porch. Intrigued by the cloth, he picked it up and sniffed it. The smell was so strong that it made her stagger. Cordes described the smell as an electric shock that made her body go limp until she nearly fainted, and her husband had to be helped into the house. Moments later, her lips and face began to swell and her mouth began to bleed, symptoms that lasted nearly 2 hours. The police were called and took the handkerchief as evidence. When they searched the scene, they also found a lockpick and a small canister on the terrace. The police then concluded that the perpetrator may have tried to break into the house, but failed and then ran away, leaving behind the gas-sprayed cloth and some items he was carrying. Surprisingly, when the cloth was analyzed, no traces of chemicals were found. A few days later, the gasser struck again. This time, he was found spraying gas on residents' open windows. The attacks continued, and Mattoon residents began giving testimony about the Mad Gasser. The figure was always described as a tall, thin man dressed all in black. The mass fear and panic continued and intensified. As panic grew in Mattoon, the army called in chemical weapons experts. Their best hypothesis was that the chemical may have been chlorpecrin, a sweet-smelling chemical used to kill rodents. But evidence and analysis found no trace of the chemical, and the reported symptoms of the attack did not match the effects chlorpecrin could cause. Not satisfied with this explanation, men armed with rifles began patrolling the streets of Mattoon at night to hunt down the Mad Gasser. Women began to carry clubs whenever they left the house. The panic and turmoil even caused residents to start staying with friends instead of sleeping alone. The police began to compile a list of suspects. The police included people who could be the culprits on the list, ranging from a chemistry teacher, violent people with criminal records, and even Nazi or Japanese prisoners of war. People known to have basement laboratories were investigated, and the police also began calling psychiatric hospitals to see if any of the newly released patients were obsessed with poison gas. When the police began to intensify their investigation, instead of decreasing it, the opposite happened. Because after that, more attacks were reported, and the police were always overwhelmed by the evidence of the attacks, because Mad Gasser rarely left a trace. Eventually, the FBI had to step in to investigate the case. Even so, reports continued to come in, and the case became more widespread. However, despite a number of leads, the police and the FBI were unable to come to a concrete conclusion about what happened in Mattoon. As a result, rumors began to circulate that the assailant was an escaped mental patient or a German spy testing poison gas. These rumors further panicked residents. Citizens increasingly took to the streets with guns to patrol and prevent further attacks. Unfortunately, the attacks continued. In some of these attacks, the perpetrators even seemed to deliberately leave untraceable evidence, as if mocking the police and experts. One night, residents saw a suspicious person. He had the same features as the Mad Gasser, tall and dressed in black. They immediately turned him over to the police. The villagers were sure that this person was the culprit. But when the police administered a lie detector test, the person was found innocent and eventually released. This, of course, immediately ignited the anger of the citizens, prompting them to hold a rally on Saturday, September 10, 1944, claiming that the police were incompetent in their handling of the case. News of the Mad Gasser case spread far and wide, beating out war news for a place on the front pages of newspapers across the country. Mad Gasser has increased his attacks. There were approximately 8 additional attacks. One of the victims was Ms. Frances Smith, who claimed to have heard the sound of spraying from outside her home and believed it to be Mad Gasser's atomizer in operation. Shortly thereafter, a local psychic named Edna James smelled a strange odor that piqued her curiosity, and she investigated. She later claimed to have encountered an ape-like man with long outstretched arms holding a spray gun who sprayed her 3 times, numbing her arms and legs. By September 11th, Mad Gasser's paranoia had reached normal levels. FBI agents were still trying to determine the type of gas used, while police had to divide their focus between finding the perpetrators and keeping an eye on the protesting citizens. Some residents are still on patrol, carrying guns here and there. This is certainly causing inconvenience throughout the city. In the end, the unsuccessful investigation led the police to issue a controversial statement on September 12, 1944. Eugene Cole, Mattoon's chief of police, issued a statement saying that the smell was probably caused by gas accidentally released from the diesel engine plant. The gas was probably carried by the wind into the homes, causing paralysis. Cole also added that the Mad Gasser character is just a figment of the imagination. Cole insisted that the whole case was a mistake from beginning to end. This statement, of course, provoked various kinds of protests. One strong protest came from a spokesman for the diesel engine manufacturer Atlas Imperial. The company quickly denied accusations that it had caused chaos in the city. They emphasized that the use of gas at the plant was very limited, and only in firefighting equipment. The amount of gas would not have been enough to poison the city's residents. Atlas Imperial also emphasized that its plant had been certified safe by the state health department. After the company's rebuttal, the police seemed to have nothing more to say, preferring to keep quiet and not bring up Mad Gasser again. On the other hand, some of the same cases continued to occur, leaving residents to take matters into their own hands. On September 13th, an attack occurred that was believed to be the key clue to Mad Gasser's identity. The attack happened to Bertha Birch and her son, who caught the perpetrator spraying gas into the bedroom window. The perpetrator immediately fled and disappeared. Nevertheless, Bertha Birch had a clear view of the perpetrator's face. Bertha described the perpetrator as a woman dressed in men's clothing. The clothes were all black, and at first glance, her figure would look like the characteristics described by the residents, except that she was a woman. Whether it was a coincidence or not, the Mad Gasser of Mattoon has never attacked again. Although the case is no longer active and the investigation has been closed, there are still many unanswered questions about the identity of Mad Gasser. The latest news that she is a woman does not seem to be enough to reveal the identity of the perpetrator. Some believe the news and some still believe that Mad Gasser is a man. Many also believe that he is a mad scientist trying out his inventions. There are also those who believe that she is a widow trying to vent her grief over the death of her husband. In a more extreme theory, it is even believed that he was a government agent spraying some sort of brainwashing gas. The mysteries surrounding the story of the Mattoon Mad Gasser are many, but there are a few important details that stick in our minds, including why the clairvoyant Edna James described him attackers as monkeys, and why the Mad Gasser always stops his attacks without seriously injuring or killing anyone, yet still poses a real threat, a menacing aura without overt violence. What kind of person would randomly spread poisonous gas in people's homes, but not with the intention of killing them? Did Mad Gasser simply want to terrorize and panic people? Or was it a test of a weapon of war? Or is it true what Eugene Cole said, that Mad Gasser is just a figment of the public's imagination? Public Health Commissioner Thomas Wright argues that it is true, and there is no doubt that there is poisoning of residents. But actual poisoning does not mean that there has been a poison gas attack. In addition, the number of people affected by the poisonous gas was not as high as reported. In a sense, most of the reports from the villagers were just hysteria. They heard that people were being gassed, and then they panicked when they smelled a smell they rarely smelled, or when they saw a shadow in the window and thought it was an attack, and they became hysterical. The idea that Mattooners experienced only mass hysteria is supported by many experts, local officials, and some media outlets. In fact, this story has been used for decades as an example of mass hysteria caused by world wars and women left behind by their husbands. The mass hysteria theory was also supported by psychologists Donald Johnson and J.P. Chaplin. According to these psychologists, effects such as dizziness, nausea, and vomiting are actually the effects of mass hysteria. As J.P. Chaplin wrote in his 1959 book, Rumor, Fear, and the Madness of Crowds, he concluded that the Mad Gasser of Mattoon may have been one of the purest mass hysterias ever recorded. But not everyone is convinced and agrees with this explanation. In a book entitled The Mad Gasser of Mattoon, Dispelling the Hysteria, published in 2003 by high school science teacher and Mattoon native Scott Maruna. According to Maruna, this event cannot be considered mass hysteria because many reports mention the smell of gas coming from windows and the presence of human figures running in the dark. So there are indeed people spreading the gas. Maruna explained that in Mattoon at the time, there was a very bookish, genius student named Farley Llewellyn, a chemistry major who liked to experiment with various chemicals. One day his lab exploded until his neighbors heard it. Maruna believes that Farley Llewellyn is the real gas-spewing madman. It turns out that Llewellyn was damaged by being ostracized by society because he was suspected of being a homosexual. So he had motives as well as skills. That's why the victims of the attack seemed random, because he had a grudge against the whole community. In fact, most of the attacks occurred near his home. Poison gas-related incidents with similar symptoms are not unique to Mattoon. On September 22nd in 1933, in Mattoon, Virginia, Mrs. Carl Hoffman also smelled a strange, sweet smell in her house. Mrs. Hoffman felt dizzy, but the smell soon disappeared. At 10:30 p.m., the odor returned. This time the sensation was so strong that 8 members of the Hoffman family and a guest who was staying overnight felt the effects. All who smelled the odor felt nausea, dizziness, facial cramps, and shortness of breath. Mrs. Hoffman's 20-year-old daughter was the worst affected. Fortunately, her life was saved, but a few weeks after the incident, she was still experiencing frequent cramps in her limbs. When the police inspected the scene, they found only a trail of high heels near the window. 2 days later, the mysterious odor returned to Cloverdale. Clarence Hall and his wife were home. It was 9 p.m., and their sense of smell picked up a strange, sweet odor that was very strong. Immediately, they both felt weak and dizzy. Police investigating the case found that the smell was concentrated in a nail hole in the window. The police believed that this hole was used to spray the odorous gas into the house. On January 10, 1933, there was a similar incident, also at 10 p.m. Mrs. Moore reported strange noises in the yard, followed by a shadowy figure near the window. Soon after, Mrs. Moore began to smell a strange odor of gas. Moore immediately grabbed her baby and ran outside. But despite her quick actions, the gas still caused her body to convulse for a moment. In 1972, workers at a Midwestern University data center complained that they had been victims of a gas attack. They claimed to have been exposed to a mysterious gas from an unknown source, which caused dizziness, fainting, nausea, and vomiting. At least 10 workers were treated for their symptoms, and the data center was evacuated. Despite repeated testing, no definitive cause could be found. In the end, no one knows for sure whether the mad gasser of Mattoon was actually an attack or just a mass hysteria. It is possible that this incident was indeed an attack, but it may also be true that there was a phenomenon of hysteria from some people who were experiencing fear because of the raging war. Especially in those years, America was facing 2 great powers, namely Germany and Japan. The fear that Germany and Japan would start using chemical weapons haunted Americans and made them act as they feared.